Okay, so really happy to be here at this first Slack user conference. My name's Chris. I'm an industry analyst at 451 Research. So we cover as a firm everything enterprise IT. And as part of our overall coverage, I head the workforce productivity research practice, which comprises myself and a number of other analysts looking at everything business productivity software, essentially. So the main thrust of what I want to talk about during this session is essentially how we need to think about our workforce tools differently, right? And how we need to think about our workforce, what our workforce tools are for differently. I think probably the very fact that you're all here, you're all aware of the fact that the nature of work is changing, right? How we think about work, how we think about the design and conduct and execution of work, regardless of use case or business team that you belong to, is really radically changing in the context of wider sort of digital disruption trends and themes. Right, so one of the things that we consistently hear about when we speak to enterprises about their kind of work management challenges is how often complex, often specialist work is actually decentralizing increasingly into business teams. Right, so where historically at least some of that, and currently where a lot of that is still sort of handled, designed, overseen, monitored, managed by business process specialists, business analysts, and other kind of specialist roles, increasingly when we speak to enterprises, we hear that actually this is decentralizing, into business teams. So, increasingly we hear of the desire for and need for more local autonomy over the design of complex specialist work, the desire for new types of flexible workflow, more purposeful types of collaboration, right? So this is super interesting, I think, because this allows us to think about work culture in a way that we've never historically either needed to or had the ability to. So already when I talk about work culture in that way, for some people that may seem odd, right? This is an unusual way to think about work culture. And I was thinking, if you ask a colleague of yours or maybe someone you come across at an event like this and you say, what company do you work for and what's the work culture like? You'd probably get like 120 different answers for every 100 people you ask. Right? Some people might talk about, or they might make reference to their company's, I don't know, maybe publicly stated values or beliefs, right? Some people may talk about how they do daily stand-ups or, talk about things like remote working and telecommuting as things they think embody their company, their organization's work culture. In the UK, if you ask that question, people might very reasonably say, our work culture is, 9 to 5 and then we hit the pub, right? So you ask that question, you get a whole bunch of different answers for it. And really, none of those, I think, go anywhere near to encapsulating the potential of what we can now think about as work culture and what that can mean for our organization from using technologies like Slack and other kind of new generation work management tools. Right, so already, we need to sort of think about our frames of reference a little bit differently. We need to think about the narrative differently. And we need to think about what our workforce tools are for and what the potential is in terms of what they can deliver to our organizational design and forms and what we're delivering to our customers and users. So not a bad place to start, I think, is to ask this question, right? How much do you actually love your tools? Right? So maybe let's put that to the test now. Let's put Slack to one side. I think we're all self-qualifying as people who are interested in Slack by being here. So let's put Slack to one side. Hands up if any of you are using a tool, an application, a piece of software in your kind of day-to-day work that you would genuinely say you really love, right? Not just that you like the UI or it's got like a cool mobile version of the app, but that you really love and helps you think about how to do your work differently and better. So hands up if that applies to you. Okay, so I'm guessing we have about, 120 people here. I saw maybe 20, 25, 30 hands. Probably overrepresented, seeing that you're, I would guess, more than the average technologically savvy. So we should probably ask ourselves why that's a relatively small proportion of us who say, there's actually, tools that I use to get my day-to-day work done that I really love. And I think historically there's probably been a number of reasons as to why we arrive at the situation we are at now. I think in a lot of ways we've thought about work management tools as just like aggregate sets of functionality, right? So as long as it does A, B, C, and D, then we're kind of good to go. I think also, and this obviously comes from the PC era, we've thought about work tools as it being a good thing that they standardize behaviors and practices, right? So, we're all working in the same kind of assets, we all have the same kinds of tools to collaborate with. There's like a level playing field, and that's kind of how we think about productivity, right? We set this level playing field, and we gradually think about incremental sort of productivity gains off the back of that. So, really, to me, that doesn't in any way speak to the need to deeply engage, empower, and enthuse our workforce, which I think is at the back of what we're seeing in terms of new generation kind of tools. So really how I would think about it is we need to look at what tools can give us a distinctly enterprise-focused ability to decentralize autonomy over the creation of workflow, combine that with more purposeful types of collaboration, the ability to craft workflows across applications, so we have straightforward multi-application workflows in a ways that allows local business teams to really think about new ways to address business challenges, business opportunities, and new ways to think about sort of problem resolution in your business context. So, when we ask ourselves this question, it's not like a sort of nice to have. We're not giving ourselves a luxury to think about a sort of nice to have thing. This isn't a sideline. Increasingly, this is the kind of context I would suggest to thinking about whether we're actually equipping our workforce in a way that can take advantage of this sort of changing nature, changing evolution of work. And we already see examples of companies when we sort of speak to enterprises over the course of our research that are taking advantage of the coming together of workflow creation, sort of low, no-code workflow creation, more interoperability across apps and workflows, the embeddedness of collaboration and communications in those workflows, to really find different ways to impact their bottom line. And really, that's at the back of most of what I'm saying. Behind this is the belief in the business value of directly empowering and engaging your users in a way that isn't just for their own sort of welfare, isn't just for the purposes of your own staff retention, isn't just for the purposes of sort of incrementally increasing general productivity, but with a view to sort of crafting a more direct causal link between the empowerment of your users and finding new ways to answer some of these business objectives. Right, so just to give maybe a couple of examples of this to try and bring it to life a little bit more. So we spoke to the HR department of a retail organization a couple of months ago, right? So they were essentially tasked by their executive management team with coming up with ways to create more successful hiring strategies, right? So they took advantage of some of these technologies and approaches that I've been talking about to create a more seamless and singular experience across candidate marketing to recruitment to onboarding, right? So much more collaborative experience between candidates, potential candidates, and internal stakeholders, and collaborative experience between those internal stakeholders, whether it's someone with an HR, a staffing manager, a hiring manager, etc. Really interestingly, this company also created a mobile-only version of the app. So they specifically went mobile-only and not desktop for their in-store hiring managers, right? So these guys and women spend all of their time pretty much on the shop floor. They don't have time to go off and find a meeting room and to log on to GoToMeeting or whatever to try and interview a candidate, right? So they had a mobile-only version of their hiring app, which granted them the ability to do single-click approval or rejection of candidate applications. It also allowed them to, through video on the mobile device, interview candidates sort of in real time, right? So all they needed to do was sort of step off the shop floor. They could potentially, depending on the context, I guess, even do it on the shop floor and interview people, decide whether to pass them to the next stage through the funnel. Another example, so we talked to the operations team of a manufacturing organization that was responsible for the output of a particular sort of factory site. And they were one of a number of different factory sites operated by this manufacturing organization. And they were doing really interesting things in terms of making the decision to decentralize the autonomy over the creation of work processes to those ops teams within each individual factory site, having standardized them across factory sites previously. Right? So you would have each factory site creating very tailored, customized work processes that catered to their own particular market requirements, right? And they were predicated on a number of different sort of criteria unique to that geography. The super interesting thing was that each of those factory teams could collaborate with one another, share best practices. They each had the same access to a central set of information resources. The management team overseeing the operations of those different factory sites was also able to collaboratively share best practices from across their different ops teams. And we're also using things like metadata structures to be able to consistently report on the output against a consistent set of KPIs across those different sites. So a third example, slightly less specific though, we come across an increasing number of use cases within companies where they are leveraging things like crowdsource ideation, right, across their workforce. Right? So they would have a particular business challenge they wanted to think about. Often it's like cost savings. It could be about product innovation. It could be around marketing messaging for the organization. So the ability to essentially tap the creativity and enthusiasm and sort of proactiveness of people within their workforce who would never normally have had a voice to actually contribute to the resolution of that particular business goal. So we came across a super interesting example of an aerospace company who had done this around a cost-saving initiative and had the entire workforce or most of it exposed to the challenge, and they were using a particularly interesting bit of software that allowed them to funnel those ideas down to a shortlist, which were then sort of judged and evaluated, and then it was decided on which one they would proceed with. The winning idea actually came from the receptionist within their main office, right? So someone who would never previously have been involved in that kind of process. So again, what do those three scenarios have in common? It's the belief by those companies that really decentralizing autonomy, tapping into the enthusiasm, the creativity of their workforce has direct business value to them, right? So this is the kind of notion of a sort of coherent, enthused, engaged work culture, which I think we're now able to talk about in a much more material way than we historically have been. So as a kind of research practice, we were thinking about different ways to articulate some of these trends, different ways to kind of create a frame of reference to be able to talk about this. And we came up with this, what we call a hierarchy of employee motivation, which is a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy. But really, as you go up the pyramid, you're getting more to the self-actualization of the individual, but as an employee within an employment scenario. Right? So this is actually taken from a paper we did, which I think, if not already, I think by the end of this session will be available through the Frontiers mobile app. I think it's linked to my session details, so you'll be able to pull the PDF out of that. So I won't go through all of this in a lot of detail. I'll just give you a little bit of flavor as to our thinking as to why each of these stages are as they are, and what we think it means when you go up the pyramid. Actually, in the PDF, if you have a look at it, you'll see two stages that I'm not actually showing on this slide that are sort of on the bottom of this pyramid, and they're what we call disengaged and resigned, which I actually think probably is where most of us are in terms of most of our tools. Right? You're either asked to use something, and it's just a horrendous experience, totally doesn't suit your own work style or practice, and you just say, I'm not going to use that, right? So you either find a different tool, or you just don't engage with that work, and we've seen plenty of examples of that. Or you're resigned, whereby you kind of say, well, it's not the best thing in the world, it's not the worst. Maybe your company's mandated a certain set of workflows off the back of it, so there'd be consequences if you didn't use it, so what the heck, I'll use it. And that actually, like I said, I think probably most of us across most of our tools are there in one of those two stages. But we're beginning to see and have for the past few years new technology approaches, new types of solution that begin to move us up this pyramid. Right, so starting at the bottom, where users are becoming more interested in using the technology. right? So that step after being resigned to actually sort of saying, actually, this is quite interesting. I can personalize the consumption experience a little bit more. Maybe there's like a mobile version of it that allows you to sort of work remotely a little bit more or be a bit more productive when you're working remotely. And then moving up the pyramid, I think the sort of next stage is a really interesting one. And again, in the paper, there's a lot more detail as to what, why we think this shift is happening. But this shift from very kind of siloed teams organizationally to more kind of organic, shifting communities that coalesce around a particular business challenge. So again, you could think about those examples of sort of crowdsourced ideation as a kind of variant of that. And then, again, next stage up the pyramid, and I've talked about this a little bit already, but the sort of decentralization of autonomy around creating workflows, greater interoperability across apps, more purposeful types of embedded collaboration within those workflows that begin to make people realize that actually they can determine the design of how they actually get their work done rather than that being predicated on the limitations of the technology that they've been provisioned with. And then the sort of further you go up the pyramid, employees really becoming loyal stakeholders, more pervasive automation, driving engagement around work processes and workflows, more pervasive sort of role-based reporting that allows the direct contributions to be recognized, right, and for that to be acted on rather than it being something that's sort of uncovered as a manager or an oversight team is assessing how a particular project or program delivery went. To really the top of the pyramid, which I think is maybe some way off yet, but where technologies are enabling people to really think in a much more self-directed way about their own sort of continuous learning and development in terms of their own work context, where they can begin to value new types of sort of peer-to-peer exchange, and where they just take more responsibility for the impact within their organization. Right, so again, if you're interested in maybe some of the more detail behind these stages, pull off the PDF from the app and have a look at it. And really the point of this, I guess, is to try and paint a picture of how we're seeing technologies become much more user-centric, become much more focused on sort of engaging employees, but not really just engaging employees, because I don't think that goes far enough. This is about sort of really enlivening and enthusing people to find new ways to do to address their business tasks. So maybe if I just pause for a second and just sort of recap on what I've said so far. So, the nature of work is changing, autonomy is decentralizing, business teams are being asked to manage and design complex and specialist work in a way that they've traditionally not been able to do, and where that's actually been the purview of specialists, process specialists or analysts. This is giving new ways for them to think about how to do their work more effectively in a local, tailored way. Right, so hopefully I've persuaded you already that this is this means way more than just increasing work throughput. Again, which I think is one of the ways we typically think about productivity software and how we sort of increase overall execution value. Right, this is about something higher order. This is about something more interesting than that. So we actually have a term within our research called the liquid enterprise, which is the phrase we use to describe companies who are getting this right. So balancing the kind of local agility of business teams with central oversight that can guide that local execution, with the sort of design and creation of workflow at the local level to create this sort of tactical mesh of workflows that sum up into a strategic set of operations, whereby the kind of rethinking of work at the local level really begins to sort of feed in a direct and continuous way into improvements at the corporate level. And we're beginning to see examples of companies who are essentially, what this does is flip the equation, right? So rather than top-down creating what are regarded as strategic processes and looking for the tactical trickle-down, it's essentially inverting that. Another way to look at this is how, by creating this kind of differentiated culture of work execution, this is actually, if you think about it, really has the potential to be really opaque to competition, right? So when we talk to business leaders, regardless of whatever business department or division they're in, often they're really preoccupied with differentiating their own product or service or optimizing the kind of cost structure around those products and services. And not enough thought really is given to the means at which they end at that point. And of course, once you put those products and services into the market, and I'm generalizing a little bit here, I realize, but once you put those into the market, they're exposed to sort of external viewing. Whereas what we're seeing, and maybe the example of that manufacturing company with those different factory sites is a good one, the real kind of tailoring and localization of work at the local level is obviously highly useful to managers overseeing that work, because they can begin to understand what at the local level impacts delivery at the sort of corporate or divisional level. But to the competition, that's probably marginally, if at all, visible, right? So, trying to explain why I think we should be focusing more on what are the technology, what are the tools basis for creating this kind of work culture that can actually become a sort of differentiating asset for our own organizations. So again, this is from the paper, detail as to why we think each of these characteristics within technologies are the ones we think you should be evaluating. If any of you here have responsibility for evaluating tools or deploying them, or maybe you're a budget holder. So again, I won't go through these in much detail. But what I will say is that hopefully I'm sort of painting the picture that increasingly work is about more contextualized, more personalized, more localized, more ambient work, which is easily structured into flexible workflows, which is based on a sort of collective intelligence where workflows can tap into different types of data source and content repository, which allows companies to unlock new ways of thinking about how to marshal and organize their different resources that can ultimately lead to new ways of thinking about how to structure their company, design their company to better deliver to the market, right? So again, more of the detail in the paper is to each of these and how we think they can fit together. So this brings us back finally, and just to finish on this question again, right? So the kind of aggregate consequence of this, disruption in technology, people, and process and context is the creation of net new markets, right? This is the ideal place in the Bay Area to realize that that's happening, and for existing markets to be differently arranged, and for competition within those markets to mean something different. So, it's super important, I think, that we think about this idea of what a coherent work culture is that can really tap into the dynamism of our workforce and, leverage their own energy and enthusiasm. Not as a sort of nice to have, but really as the basis on which, companies can begin to think about how they differentiate against their competition as markets are disrupted and change and evolve. So hopefully that was some food for thought. Hopefully, if you managed to find a PDF of the paper that a lot of this research was based off in the application, hopefully you find that useful. Happy to explain any more of this in detail, or if anybody has any questions now, to try and answer them now. Yeah, I think there's a microphone coming.
So the one thing you said that was kind of controversial was this idea of sort of specialization diffusing into, or the edges of the organization as opposed to out to dedicated specialists. But at the same time, things are getting increasingly complicated, and there are more and more sort of specialized things that people need to know. So the question is, where are you seeing this? Are you seeing this in certain kinds of organizations, or in certain levels of certain organizations, or do you think that in fact specialization is collapsing upon itself?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, so each of those three examples I gave were fairly different ones. I wouldn't say when, the enterprises we speak to, it's particularly specific to any vertical. And I think when we say complex and specialist work, that could mean, specialist in terms of particular skills being part of the work processes through which, delivery is managed. It could just mean highly specialist and complex to do with our own company, to do with our own individual company's context, right? So it could be a very complex set of projects that need to be executed sort of concurrently and understood and reported against concurrently, right? So that doesn't necessarily infer very specialist skills in doing that, but it infers a very specialist set of projects arranged for that particular company's context. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about thinking about work culture in this way. Pretty much any enterprise of any large size will have, projects, programs, a set of collective tasks that, sum up into something that's actually quite complex in terms of, operations. So no, I don't think this is vertically or use case agnostic. We tend to see it in HR, like I gave the example of, in operations. Lots of really interesting examples in sort of retail and customer-facing industries where the imperative to be really responsive is requiring of companies to think about how they create more kind of seamless processes to be able to deliver that kind of responsiveness. So yeah, I think it's applicable to most companies. So no more questions. So again, if you're interested in any of these concepts, pull out the PDF from the session detail in the app, and happy to talk about it afterwards if anyone wants to. Thanks very much.